The church smelled of polished wood, white roses, and old dust. Sunlight poured through narrow stained glass windows, breaking across the aisle in pale colors, as Emily Hart waited outside the sanctuary doors. At 31, Emily had imagined this moment for years. Yet now, one hand wrapped around her bouquet, she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her wedding dress felt heavier than it had that morning. She glanced toward the closed doors and tried to smile. Ryan Miller was waiting patiently. Ryan had been waiting for her for nearly 2 years, ever since their first awkward conversation at a coffee shop in Tulsa. He had made her laugh when she had forgotten how. He had never demanded explanations for the parts of her past she wasn't ready to discuss. Today, he believed he was finally getting the whole of her. He was wrong. The doors opened. Emily stepped forward. Every face turned toward her. She saw her sister near the front, crying already. She saw friends smiling. And then she saw Ryan. His expression softened immediately. For a few seconds, Emily forgot everything else. Ryan looked at her, as if the entire room had disappeared. Emily smiled back, though the smile did not reach her eyes. She walked slowly down the aisle. Near the third row, Margaret Miller sat perfectly still. Ryan's mother wore a dark blue dress, and no jewelry, except a wedding ring she had kept long after her marriage ended. She did not smile. She did not cry. She simply watched Emily. There was something frightening in that stare. Not anger. Recognition. Emily's steps faltered. Ryan noticed. He whispered, "Are you okay?" Emily nodded. "I'm okay." But she wasn't. When she reached the altar, Ryan took her hand. His fingers were warm. "You're beautiful," he whispered. Emily swallowed. "So are you." The minister began speaking, but Emily barely heard him. The words seemed distant beneath the pounding of her heart. She glanced toward Margaret again. The older woman was still staring. Then Margaret stood. Ryan turned. "Mom?" Margaret did not answer. Instead, she walked toward the aisle. Emily's face lost its color. She recognized that expression. She had seen it before. 10 years ago. A voice came from behind her. "You really thought you could do this?" Emily turned. Margaret's hand disappeared beneath her jacket. For one impossible second, nobody moved. Then came the gunshot. The sound shattered the sanctuary. Emily jerked backward, her bouquet falling from her hands. White roses scattered across the floor as her knees buckled. Ryan caught her before she struck the altar. "Emily!" Screams exploded around them. Guests ran toward the doors. A chair crashed. The minister froze. A child began crying as people pushed past one another in panic. Ryan dropped to his knees, holding Emily against his chest. Blood spread across the white fabric of her dress. "No, no, no! Stay with me!" Emily tried to speak. Only a faint breath escaped. Ryan pressed his hand against the wound, shaking. "Please! Somebody call 911!" Across the aisle, Margaret still held the gun. She did not run. She did not resist when police officers rushed inside. She simply stared at Emily. When an officer ordered her to drop the weapon, Margaret slowly lowered it. Then she looked at Ryan. Her face finally broke. But there was no apology in her eyes. Only grief. And something that looked disturbingly like relief. As Ryan held Emily tighter, Margaret whispered the words that would become the first clue in a case buried for 10 years. "She knows why I did it." The words remained hanging in the church long after Margaret stopped speaking. Ryan barely heard them. His entire world had narrowed to Emily's face. Paramedics rushed through the aisle, pushing frightened guests aside. One knelt beside Emily. Ryan refused to let go until they told him they needed room to work. "Sir, please move back." "She's my wife," Ryan said. "Please save her." She's not your wife yet, the minister whispered instinctively, then immediately looked horrified by his own words. Ryan stared at him. Then the paramedic said, Sir, we need you to step away. Ryan stumbled backward. His hands were covered in Emily's blood. Across the sanctuary, officers forced Margaret against a wooden pew and took the weapon from her. She offered almost no resistance. Her eyes remained fixed on Emily. Why did you shoot her? One officer demanded. Margaret said nothing. Where did you get the gun? Still nothing. Then she looked toward the ambulance doors. Has anyone asked what she did? The officer frowned. What are you talking about? 10 years ago, Margaret said quietly. Ask her what happened 10 years ago. Within minutes, Margaret was handcuffed and escorted outside. She never cried. That detail would stay with Detective Sarah Bennett long after the wedding ended. Sarah arrived minutes later, after patrol officers had secured the church and separated witnesses. She was 38, experienced enough to recognize violence that had been rehearsed in someone's mind for years. She entered the sanctuary slowly. The room looked like a nightmare. White petals covered the floor. A broken glass vase lay beside the altar. Blood stained the fabric where Emily had fallen. Sarah crouched near the pew where Margaret had been standing. An officer approached. Shooter is in custody. Margaret Miller, 59, mother of the groom. Sarah looked toward the ambulance. Victim? Emily Hart, 31. Paramedics are still working on her. And the groom? Ryan Miller. He's outside. Completely distraught. Sarah nodded. Then she noticed something unusual. A detective nearby was questioning Margaret through the church doors. Sarah watched as Margaret suddenly raised her voice. I want to know if you found it. Found what? The truth. Sarah stepped closer. Margaret's expression was strangely calm. She did something 10 years ago. She said, You need to find out what it was. Sarah studied her carefully. You're saying the shooting was revenge? Margaret stared directly at her. I'm saying she knew this day would come. Sarah said nothing. Ryan sat on the ambulance steps, staring at his blood-stained hands. His mother had destroyed the day he had spent months planning, but the deeper wound was her question. What had Emily done? Ryan's sister, Melissa, arrived and immediately collapsed against him. She would never hurt anyone. Melissa sobbed. Ryan shook his head. I don't understand. Neither did Emily's parents. They described her as kind, hardworking, and private, but nothing more. Sarah listened without interrupting. Then she asked Ryan a simple question. Did Emily ever mention anything about 10 years ago? Ryan frowned. No. His answer was immediate. Sarah returned to the evidence room that evening and requested Emily's phone. The device contained ordinary messages. Then she found the deleted conversations. Most had been erased recently. The sender was unidentified. Sarah recovered one message timestamped 3 days before the wedding. She read it. You can't marry Ryan without telling him the truth. Sarah leaned back. For the first time, the shooting stopped looking like the beginning of a story. It looked like the end of one. And somewhere inside Emily's missing messages was a secret that had survived for 10 years. The message stayed on Sarah Bennett's screen long after everyone else had gone home. You can't marry Ryan without telling him the truth. It was the first crack in a story that, only hours earlier, had seemed simple. A bride had been shot. A mother had pulled the trigger. But Sarah had learned that the simplest explanations were usually the ones worth questioning. By morning, she had requested every record she could find concerning Emily Hart's life 10 years earlier. Emily had been 21 then. She was attending a local college in Oklahoma, studying communications, and working nights at a roadside diner to pay her expenses. Friends described her as ambitious but restless. She had wanted to leave Oklahoma eventually, although nobody could explain why she suddenly stopped talking about her plans. Sarah spread the records across her desk. One name appeared repeatedly: Claire Dawson. Claire had been Emily's closest friend during the period. They had shared classes, late-night meals, and long conversations after exhausting shifts at the diner. Sarah found Claire living in a small house outside Tulsa. When Claire opened the door, she recognized Emily's name before Sarah finished introducing herself. "I knew something like this would happen," Claire said. Sarah studied her. "You knew Emily was in danger?" Claire looked away. "No. I knew the past wasn't finished with her." Inside, Claire kept the curtains closed even though it was morning. She sat across from Sarah with both hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. At first, she refused to talk about the years Emily had tried to forget. She changed after one night. Claire finally said, "What night?" Claire shook her head. "I don't want to put words into something I never fully understood." Sarah remained patient. "What did you understand?" Claire stared at the table. Emily was afraid. That was the first detail Sarah had heard that sounded less like rumor and more like memory. Claire eventually described Emily as someone who had become increasingly secretive. She began taking calls outside. She stopped trusting people. Sometimes, during their night shifts, Emily would suddenly leave the diner without explaining where she was going. Then Claire mentioned a man, Thomas Reed. He was older, married, wealthy, and well known around town. He owned several businesses and had a reputation for getting what he wanted. According to Claire, Thomas had first approached Emily when she was working at the diner. Their relationship developed quietly. Emily never called it love. Claire remembered asking her whether she was seeing him. Emily had simply said, "It's complicated." Thomas's marriage was already troubled, but he remained with his wife, Margaret. Sarah stopped writing. "Margaret Miller?" Claire nodded slowly. "Yes. Margaret Reed back then." The connection landed with unsettling force. The woman who had murdered Emily at the altar had once been married to the man Emily secretly knew. Sarah asked what happened between Emily and Thomas. Claire hesitated. Then she remembered one conversation. It had happened shortly after the night that changed Emily. Emily had been sitting on the floor of Claire's apartment, crying so quietly that Claire almost didn't notice. She had looked up and whispered, "Something happened that night, and if people find out, everything is over." Claire had asked what happened. Emily never answered. Sarah closed her notebook. For 10 years, Emily had carried a secret. Now Sarah knew the secret had a name: Thomas Reed. And somehow, that name connected the murdered bride to the woman who had pulled the trigger. But there was another question Sarah could not ignore. Why would Margaret wait 10 years to confront Emily, only to choose her son's wedding as the moment for revenge? Whatever had happened between Thomas, Emily, and Margaret had not simply remained buried. It had grown, decade after decade, until the wedding finally gave it a place to explode. Sarah needed to know what happened that night. The name Thomas Reed changed the direction of Sarah Bennett's investigation. Until Claire Dawson's interview, Emily's past had looked like a collection of unanswered questions. Now those questions had a center: Thomas. Sarah pulled archived marriage records, property documents, and old newspaper articles. Within hours, she confirmed what Claire had already suggested. Thomas Reed had been married to Margaret for nearly 17 years. The discovery made the wedding shooting more disturbing. Margaret had not simply been the groom's mother. She had once been the wife of the man at the center of Emily's secret. Sarah returned to the cold case files. Thomas had disappeared 10 years earlier. At the time, investigators had found his truck near a lake outside town. His wallet was inside. His keys were still in the ignition. There had been no confirmed sighting of him afterward. The newspapers had described his disappearance as mysterious. Margaret had described it differently. According to her original statement, Thomas had been distant for months. She suspected he was having an affair. Their marriage had become bitter, filled with arguments and long silences. Then he vanished. Sarah found another detail buried in the file. 3 days before Thomas disappeared, someone had contacted him from the roadside diner where Emily worked. The caller's identity had never been established. Sarah stared at the record. Emily had been working that night. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Meanwhile, Ryan remembered that period differently. He had been 16 when his father disappeared. He remembered his mother's face the morning police arrived. He remembered her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. But nobody explained anything. His father had simply become a subject that could not be discussed. When Sarah interviewed him, Ryan struggled to understand why the past was suddenly being dragged into his wedding. "My mother never told me he was involved with another woman," he said. "Did she ever mention Emily?" "No." "Did you know Emily before you started dating her?" Ryan shook his head. "Not until years later." Sarah watched his expression. There was genuine confusion there. That mattered. If Ryan had known the truth, his relationship with Emily might have been part of a larger plan. But he appeared to know nothing. Sarah's next interview was with Margaret. She was being held in a county detention facility, awaiting formal charges. When Sarah entered the interview room, Margaret was sitting perfectly upright. No tears. No visible fear. Only exhaustion. Sarah placed a photograph of Thomas on the table. Margaret's eyes changed instantly. "You found him," she whispered. "We found his records." Margaret looked at the photograph for several seconds. "Why are you asking about him?" "Because Emily knew him." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Emily knew a lot of things. Was she involved with your husband?" Silence. Then Margaret leaned forward. "She wasn't just the woman who knew my husband." Sarah waited. Margaret's voice dropped. "She was the reason I lost everything." "Your husband disappeared," Sarah said. "That's not the same thing as losing everything." Margaret looked directly into her eyes. "You don't know what happened." "Then tell me." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." Sarah pushed the photograph closer. "What happened 10 years ago?" Margaret's eyes filled with something Sarah could not identify. Fear. Anger. Perhaps regret. But she said nothing more. Sarah left the room knowing one thing for certain. Margaret was protecting someone. The question was whether that person was Thomas, Emily, or herself. Before leaving, Sarah asked one final question. "Did you know Emily was going to marry Ryan?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "I knew." "How long?" A pause. "Long enough." Sarah stopped at the door. "Then why didn't you stop the wedding?" Margaret finally looked up. "Because I wanted her to stand where everyone could see her." Sarah felt a chill. "And why?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Because some truths only hurt when there is nowhere left to hide." Sarah left without another word. Outside, she immediately called her team and ordered them to reopen every file connected to Thomas Reed's disappearance. The past was no longer background information. It was evidence. And for the first time, Sarah wondered whether the wedding had been planned around a secret rather than love. If Margaret had known about the marriage long before the ceremony, then the shooting could not have been an impulsive act. It had been waiting. Somewhere in the missing years was the answer, and Sarah intended to find it before another secret disappeared from the record forever again too. The past was no longer background information. It was evidence. Sarah Bennett returned to the old case with a new understanding of the people involved. Claire Dawson agreed to speak again, this time about the night she had spent 10 years trying to forget. According to Claire, Emily had discovered something disturbing about Thomas Reed. He had been using secrets to control people around him. He knew which employees were desperate, which business partners were vulnerable, and which family members could be manipulated through fear. Emily had found documents that suggested Thomas was hiding money and threatening people who tried to challenge him. But there was something worse. Thomas had been using his own family as leverage. Margaret had suspected his behavior for years, but Emily had uncovered details Margaret had never seen. Emily believed that if she gave the evidence to police, Thomas could lose everything. Claire remembered Emily's fear. She kept saying she had to confront him, Claire told Sarah. I begged her not to. What did she think would happen? Sarah asked. She thought he would finally tell the truth. Instead, Emily arranged to meet Thomas. The meeting happened on a cold Oklahoma night near the lake where his vehicle would eventually be found. Claire did not witness the confrontation, but Emily called her shortly before leaving. Her voice had been shaking. If I don't call you later, call the police. Claire asked why. Emily answered, because he knows I have the evidence. That was the last conversation Claire had with her that night. According to the reconstructed timeline, Emily met Thomas shortly after 10 o'clock. They argued. Thomas demanded that she hand over whatever she had discovered. Emily refused. She told him she would expose him. Thomas became furious. The confrontation escalated, and witnesses later reported hearing raised voices near the lake, although nobody could confirm exactly what happened afterward. By morning, Thomas was gone. His truck was discovered near the water. The driver's door was unlocked. His wallet remained inside. His phone was missing. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, and investigators found no body. At the time, the simplest explanation seemed possible. Thomas had abandoned his family. Margaret was devastated. Ryan was 16 and too young to understand why his father had vanished without saying goodbye. For years, the family lived with that uncertainty. Eventually, the investigation went cold. No body meant no clear crime. No reliable witness meant no suspect. And without Thomas, there was nobody to explain what had happened. But Sarah was no longer looking at the case as a disappearance. She was looking at it through Emily's death. She requested the original witness statements and began rebuilding the final 24 hours of Thomas's life minute by minute. One record immediately caught her attention. A phone call had been placed to Thomas shortly before he left town. The number belonged to Emily. Sarah checked the timing again. The call had lasted 11 minutes. She requested the old telephone records and found something even more troubling. Emily had been the last confirmed person known to have spoken with Thomas before he disappeared. Sarah sat back in silence. The bride murdered at the altar had once been the last known person connected to a missing man. That could have been coincidence. But there were too many coincidences now. Thomas had disappeared. Emily had known his secrets. Margaret had spent 10 years blaming Emily. And now Emily was dead. Sarah closed the file, but the question remained. What happened beside that lake 10 years ago? Because if Emily had been responsible for Thomas's disappearance, then the shooting might not have been revenge for an affair. It might have been punishment for something far darker. And if Margaret had decided to settle that old personal score, Sarah needed to know what Emily had actually done before the truth could be buried again. The question followed Ryan long after Sarah left him. What had Emily done? He sat alone in his apartment that night, staring at their wedding photograph. Emily was smiling in it, her head resting against his shoulder. Nothing about her expression suggested the woman Sarah had described. Ryan wanted to believe there was an explanation. There had to be. He remembered the first time Emily became uncomfortable when his father was mentioned. They had been sitting in a restaurant when Ryan casually brought up Thomas. Emily had dropped her fork. She recovered quickly, but Ryan remembered. He remembered other moments too. Whenever he asked about the years before they met, Emily changed the subject. She never spoke about Oklahoma college life, even though she had spent years there. Once, after an argument, she had looked at him with tears in her eyes and asked a question he had never forgotten. "If I made a terrible mistake, would you still love me?" Ryan had laughed nervously then. "Of course." She had smiled. Now that memory felt different. By morning, Sarah asked Ryan to meet her at the evidence office. "I need you to see something," she said. Ryan followed her into a room where several evidence bags rested on a table. Sarah opened the first one. Inside was a photograph of Emily standing beside Claire Dawson outside the diner where they had worked. The second photograph showed Emily with Thomas Reed. Ryan stared at it. His stomach tightened. "That's my father," Sarah nodded. "I know." Ryan pushed the photograph away. "No. There has to be another explanation." Sarah opened another bag. Handwritten notes. Some were dated 10 years earlier. Others contained fragments of conversations, names, and times. Ryan recognized Emily's handwriting immediately. He picked up one page. The writing was rushed. "Thomas knows." He read the line again. "Thomas knows what?" Sarah did not answer. Instead, she placed a damaged digital recorder on the table. "We recovered this from Emily's storage unit." Ryan stared at it. "You searched her things?" "We obtained a warrant." His voice hardened. "She was going to tell me." Sarah looked at him. "Did she?" Ryan said nothing. Sarah connected the recorder to a computer. Static filled the room. Then Emily's voice emerged. It sounded younger. Frightened? Ryan froze. The recording was dated 10 years earlier. Emily was breathing heavily, as if she had been crying. "I don't know what he's going to do," she said. There was a long silence. Then another voice could be heard faintly in the background. Ryan couldn't make out the words. Emily continued. "If anything happens to me, Margaret needs to know the truth about Thomas." Ryan stopped breathing. The recording ended. For several seconds, neither man nor woman spoke. Ryan whispered, "Why would she say my mother's name?" Sarah looked at him. "That's what we're trying to find out." Ryan stared at the recorder. His memories suddenly rearranged themselves. Emily's hesitation. Her fear. Her question about forgiveness. The way she had avoided his father's name. None of it seemed accidental anymore. He had believed his marriage was built on honesty. Now he understood that Emily had carried a secret directly into their relationship. And whatever happened 10 years earlier had involved his father, his mother, and the woman he loved. Ryan covered his face with both hands. "She was going to tell me," he said. Sarah remained silent. Ryan looked up. "When?" Sarah hesitated. "According to the message we recovered, she was supposed to tell you after the wedding." Ryan's eyes filled with tears. The revelation destroyed the peace of certainty he had been holding on to. Emily had not intended to die with the secret. She had intended to confess. But somebody had made sure she never got the chance. And now Sarah needed to understand why Margaret had been so determined to silence her before that confession could happen. The realization that Margaret had stopped Emily from confessing changed everything. Sarah Bennett returned to the detention center that following morning. This time, she carried phone records, photographs from Emily's storage unit, and a timeline of the years following Thomas Reed's disappearance. Margaret looked at the folder without touching it. "You found something," she said. "I found enough to know that your story is incomplete." Margaret's expression hardened. Sarah sat across from her. "You believed Emily knew what happened to Thomas." "She did." "How do you know?" "Because she was there." The answer came quickly. "You're saying Emily was present when Thomas disappeared?" Margaret looked down. "I've always known she was involved." But you never told police. I had no proof. Sarah opened the folder. You spent years looking for proof. Margaret's eyes lifted. Wouldn't you? Sarah said nothing. Margaret began talking. After Thomas vanished, she searched through his accounts, his office, his contacts, and every place she thought he might have left evidence. She believed Emily was hiding something. Years passed without an answer. Then Margaret learned Emily had returned to Oklahoma, and Emily was dating Ryan. To Margaret, that was not an innocent coincidence. It was betrayal. She knew who he was, Margaret said. She knew who Ryan was. She knew what Thomas had done to us. Sarah watched her very carefully. You believed Emily deliberately entered your son's life? I believed she wanted another way into my family. Why? Because people like Emily don't forget. You've described a theory, not evidence. She destroyed my marriage. Thomas disappeared. Ryan lost his father. Then she came back and took Ryan from me too. Did Emily ever threaten you? No. Did she ever contact you? Not directly. Then how did you know she was watching your family? I knew. Sarah recognized it as suspicion, not proof. She closed the folder. Let's talk about when you discovered Emily and Ryan were together. Margaret answered immediately. Months before the wedding. Sarah looked at her. Are you certain? Yes. Sarah placed a phone record on the table. This number belonged to Emily. Then she placed another page beside it. This number belonged to you. Margaret said nothing. These records show contact between the two numbers for nearly 2 years. Margaret's face tightened quietly. Sarah continued. You had been monitoring her long before the engagement. Margaret finally looked away. I needed answers. For 2 years? You could have gone to the police. They wouldn't have believed me. Margaret's silence answered. The record showed Margaret had contacted Emily's workplace. The surveillance had begun long before Ryan proposed. Sarah stared at Margaret. You planned this. Margaret shook her head. I didn't plan to kill her. But you planned something. Margaret's eyes filled with anger. I wanted her to admit what she had done. At the wedding? She needed to understand what she had taken from us. Sarah leaned back. That was the moment she understood. The shooting was not a sudden explosion of grief. Margaret had spent years feeding her anger, watching Emily, studying her life, and waiting for an opportunity. The wedding gave her the perfect stage. But Sarah still needed one answer. What did Emily do 10 years ago that made you hate her enough to kill her? Margaret looked toward the wall. Fear appeared beneath her anger. You keep asking the wrong question. Sarah waited. Margaret whispered. You should be asking what Thomas did. Silence filled the room. Sarah gathered the records. She left believing Margaret had planned Emily's death. She left knowing something worse. Margaret had planned revenge for years. If Thomas's actions were the beginning, then Emily's secret was more dangerous than anyone understood. That evening, Sarah placed the old case documents beside Emily's records. A pattern emerged. The night Thomas disappeared, Margaret made a phone call missing from the original investigation. Now Sarah needed to know who she called again. Sarah returned to the cold case the next morning, with Margaret's warning still in her mind. What did Thomas do? The question had become impossible to separate from the murder of Emily. Sarah requested the original investigative files and spent hours reviewing photographs, witness statements, telephone records, and property reports. Most of the material had already been examined years earlier. Nothing immediately changed the story. Then she noticed a reference buried in an investigator's handwritten notes. Security footage. A retired detective named Harold Pierce had been one of the original investigators. Sarah found him living quietly outside Tulsa. When she mentioned Thomas Reed, his expression changed. You're reopening that case? Yes, Pierce sighed. There was one thing we never got. What thing? A gas station camera. He explained that the station stood several miles from the lake where Thomas's truck had been discovered. At the time, investigators believed the camera might have captured Thomas driving toward the lake. But the recording disappeared, Pierce said. Lost? That's what we were told. Sarah frowned. Who told you? Pierce shook his head. That was the problem. Nobody could explain where it went. Sarah left with the station's old address and spent the afternoon tracing the business records. The original station had closed years earlier, but the property had been purchased by another company. After several calls, Sarah learned that the security system had been replaced, but old digital archives had been transferred to an external storage facility. She obtained a copy. The footage was grainy and nearly useless at first. Sarah watched the same sequence repeatedly. 11:47 p.m. Thomas's vehicle entered the frame. He parked near the side of the building. A few minutes later, another vehicle arrived. A woman stepped out. Sarah froze. The image was blurred, but the woman's height, posture, and clothing resembled Emily. She enlarged the frame. There was no question that someone had met Thomas. But Sarah noticed movement near the edge of the recording. Another figure. Someone had been standing beside the vehicle. She slowed the footage. The figure stepped into the light for less than 3 seconds. Sarah enhanced the image. The face became clearer. Margaret. Sarah stared at the screen. For years, Margaret had claimed she suspected Emily, but had never known what happened to Thomas. The footage contradicted her. Margaret had been there. Sarah called a forensic technician and asked him to verify the enhancement. The answer came back later that evening. The figure was consistent with Margaret Miller. Sarah watched the recording again. Thomas, Emily, Margaret. All three were together on the night Thomas disappeared. She felt a chill move through her. The case had just changed completely. Emily had lied. Margaret had lied. And Thomas had disappeared immediately afterward. Sarah returned to the timeline. At 11:47, Thomas arrived. At 11:52, Emily appeared. At 11:56, Margaret entered the frame. At 12:18, Thomas's vehicle left. The women remained behind. Sarah paused the video. There was another detail. Emily appeared to be crying. Margaret appeared furious. Thomas stood between them. Sarah realized the confrontation had not been a secret meeting between Emily and Thomas. It had been a confrontation involving all three. But why? She returned to the final frame. Thomas's vehicle disappeared into the darkness. Neither Emily nor Margaret followed immediately. Sarah stared at the screen, knowing the missing hours after that moment could contain the answer to everything. The next morning, she would have to confront Margaret with the footage. And this time, Margaret would not be able to claim she had only suspected what happened. She had been there. What Sarah did not know was that the recording had captured only the beginning of the confrontation. Somewhere beyond the camera's reach, Thomas had made a decision that would destroy 3 lives. Before Sarah could understand that decision, she needed to learn why Emily and Margaret had stood together against him that night. The footage had changed the investigation, but Sarah Bennett still needed the truth behind it. She returned to Margaret with photographs from the gas station recording. This time, Margaret did not pretend to be surprised. "You were there," Sarah said. Margaret stared at the images. "Yes." "And Emily?" "Yes." "What happened to Thomas?" Margaret closed her eyes. For 10 years, she had rehearsed different versions of that night. Now there was nowhere left to hide. She finally began. Thomas had been controlling both women in different ways. With Margaret, he used money, fear, and the threat of taking away everything she depended upon. With Emily, he used their secret relationship and the information he knew about her. Emily eventually discovered evidence that Thomas had been manipulating people and hiding serious financial wrongdoing. She planned to expose him. That night, she went to the lake to confront him. Margaret had followed. She had not gone there intending to kill anyone. She wanted answers. Instead, she found Emily arguing with Thomas. "You lied to both of us," Emily had said. Thomas laughed. "You think anyone will believe you?" Emily held up the documents. "I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to see this." Thomas lunged for the evidence. Emily stepped backward. Margaret moved between them. "Leave her alone." Thomas shoved Margaret aside. Then he reached for Emily. The struggle lasted only seconds. Thomas lost his footing. He fell hard. When he stopped moving, the night became terribly quiet. Emily stared at him. Margaret knelt beside her husband and searched for a pulse. There was none. Emily began crying. "We have to call the police." Margaret looked at her. "No." Emily stared. "Margaret, he's dead." "I know." "We have to tell them." Margaret shook her head. "They'll blame you." "Then let them." "You don't understand." Margaret looked toward Thomas. "He'll destroy us even after he's dead." That sentence became the moment everything changed. Instead of calling authorities, the two women made a decision that would haunt them for the next decade. They concealed what had happened. They moved Thomas's vehicle and created the appearance that he had disappeared voluntarily. They separated afterward and agreed never to speak about that night again. But silence did not erase guilt. Emily left Oklahoma. Margaret remained. For Emily, the secret became something she desperately wanted to confess. For Margaret, it became something she believed she had sacrificed everything to protect. Years later, Emily returned and eventually met Ryan. She fell in love with him. At first, she tried to believe the past could remain buried. But guilt followed her. Margaret saw Ryan's relationship with Emily as another betrayal. She believed Emily had escaped while she had spent 10 years carrying the burden alone. "You got to leave," Margaret told Sarah. "I stayed with it. You could have told the truth." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "And destroy Ryan's life? You destroyed it anyway." Margaret looked down. That was the deeper tragedy. Emily's crime had never been murdering Thomas. It had been helping Margaret hide the truth afterward. Both women had made the same terrible choice, then spent 10 years living with different versions of guilt. Emily wanted forgiveness. Margaret wanted punishment. And when Emily finally decided to tell Ryan everything, Margaret believed the confession would erase the only thing she thought remained of her family. Sarah understood then that the wedding shooting had not begun at the altar. It had begun beside a lake 10 years earlier. But one question remained unanswered. If Margaret had planned revenge for so long, why had she waited until Emily's wedding day? The answer would reveal just how deliberately Margaret had prepared for the final confrontation. And Sarah knew the answer was hidden in Emily's final plans. She needed to discover what Emily intended to tell Ryan, and why Margaret believed that confession was worth killing for. The answer was hidden in the wedding plans. Sarah Bennett discovered that Margaret had known about the ceremony months before the invitations were mailed. She had even contacted the church without giving her name, asking about the altar arrangement and the order of the ceremony. At first, Sarah thought Margaret had planned to confront Emily publicly. Margaret eventually admitted it. She wanted everyone to hear what Emily had done. More importantly, she wanted Ryan to hear it. "She took 10 years from me," Margaret said. "I wanted her to feel what it was like to have everything taken away." Sarah asked why she had allowed the wedding to continue. Margaret looked exhausted. "Because I wanted her standing there, surrounded by people who loved her, before I told them who she really was." It was not an impulsive plan. Margaret had imagined the humiliation. She had imagined Ryan looking at Emily differently. She had imagined Emily losing the life she had built. But then something changed. 3 days before the wedding, Emily contacted Margaret. According to recovered messages, Emily said she was going to tell Ryan the truth after the ceremony. Margaret panicked. For 10 years, she had convinced herself that the secret belonged to both women. If Emily confessed, Margaret believed the family would learn everything about Thomas, the lake, and the decision they had made afterward. Ryan would lose his father all over again. The Miller family would be destroyed. Margaret decided she could not allow that. Her anger became obsession. The wedding was no longer simply a place for confrontation. It became, in Margaret's mind, the last place where she could control the story. When Sarah confronted her with the evidence, Margaret finally broke. "I thought if she died, it would be finished," she whispered. "Finished? The lies. The shame. Everything. You thought killing Emily would restore justice?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I thought she deserved to lose what she took from me." Sarah stared at her. "You didn't punish Emily. You created another family that has to live with what you did." Margaret lowered her head. For the first time since the shooting, she began to cry. She spoke about Ryan as a child, about the years after Thomas disappeared, and about waking every morning with the knowledge that she had helped hide a death. But beneath her grief was something darker. She had spent 10 years believing Emily had escaped punishment. Now Sarah understood why Margaret had watched Emily so closely, why she had followed her life, and why she had waited for the wedding. Margaret wanted the truth revealed on her terms. Instead, she had created another tragedy. Sarah left the interrogation room, knowing that Margaret's motive was finally clear. But one question remained. What exactly had Emily planned to tell Ryan after the ceremony? The answer waited inside the letter investigators had found among her belongings, a letter written for the man she never got the chance to marry. That letter could reveal whether Emily intended to confess everything about Thomas, or whether she had discovered something Margaret had spent years protecting. Sarah requested the document. If Emily had written it before the wedding, her words might explain why she believed she could save Ryan after 10 years. For Sarah, it was peace. The letter could not undo what had happened. By the time Sarah Bennett read Emily's unfinished words, Margaret Miller was facing murder charges, and the case surrounding Thomas Reed had been formally reopened. Investigators reconstructed the night at the lake as carefully as possible. The evidence confirmed that Thomas had died during the struggle, not because Emily or Margaret had entered the night intending to murder him. But the decision that followed was different. Instead of calling for help, both women chose silence. For 10 years, that silence protected them from immediate consequences while quietly destroying everything around them. Now the truth was finally public. Margaret was prosecuted for Emily's murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The weapon, the witnesses, the recovered messages, and the surveillance footage proving that she had spent years watching Emily. The defense argued that Margaret had been psychologically consumed by grief and obsession. The prosecution argued that grief could explain her pain, but it could not excuse deliberate revenge. Ryan attended the proceedings, though he rarely looked toward his mother. He had lost Emily on the day they were supposed to become husband and wife. Now he was losing Margaret to a prison sentence. But the hardest part was knowing that both women had kept the truth from him. His father had vanished. His mother had lied. His wife had carried the same secret. And Ryan had lived between them without knowing that his entire family history rested on something buried beside an Oklahoma lake. The reopened investigation also changed the way Thomas was remembered. He was no longer simply the missing husband who had disappeared without explanation. His records revealed years of intimidation, financial manipulation, and threats that explained why two frightened women had believed silence was safer than truth. But understanding was not the same as forgiveness. Sarah knew that. She had watched families search for simple answers, only to discover that tragedies rarely offered them. There were no heroes in this story, only people who had made choices under fear, anger, love, and guilt. Ryan eventually visited the lake where his father had died. He stood there for several minutes without speaking. He thought about the father he remembered, the mother he had lost, and the woman he had loved. He understood that knowing the truth would never restore his old life. It could only give him the chance to build a new one without another secret controlling it. One afternoon, Claire Dawson contacted Sarah. "There's something else," she said. Claire explained that Emily had planned to tell Ryan everything on their wedding night. She had even asked Claire to remind her if fear made her change her mind. "She wanted to stop lying," Claire said. "She wanted him to know everything." Sarah asked whether Emily had left anything behind. Claire told her about a letter. Sarah found it among Emily's belongings. It was unfinished. The first lines were addressed simply, "Ryan, if you're reading this, then I finally told you the truth." Sarah read the letter privately before giving it to Ryan. Emily explained that she had spent 10 years afraid of what the truth would cost. She admitted that she had helped Margaret conceal Thomas's death, and that she regretted it every day. She did not ask Ryan to forgive her. She only wanted him to understand that she had never intended to keep lying forever. "I love you," the letter said. "And loving you means you deserve to know who I was before you met me." Ryan read those words alone. He stopped several times, wiping tears from his face. Outside, evening settled over Oklahoma. The church where Emily had been killed was empty now. The white flowers were gone. The chairs had been cleared. The altar had been cleaned, but memory had left its own stain. Ryan folded the letter and held it against his chest. He had wanted a wedding day. Instead, he received the truth. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of everything. Emily had spent 10 years running from a secret. Margaret had spent 10 years living inside it. And when the truth finally reached the altar, there was no one left untouched by it.